Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with a discussion about the Tomb King's rework in Total War Warhammer 3, patch 6.3. A review, if you will, of the rework and what Creative Assembly can do better for them. I've just finished this campaign, etc., acquiring all of the Books of Nagash and completing all of the victory conditions. And I think the victory conditions are a good point to start with, because they're a bit ridiculous. For instance, etc., you do need to take a number of settlements in order to in your campaign. Settlements that you don't necessarily care too much about, but because it's part of the victory conditions, the game is telling you, yeah, you really should get those settlements. So for instance, over here, to quote-unquote win the campaign, I had to attack my own vassals in order to complete this campaign. So I attacked Rapans in the Wizard Caliph's palace, I attacked Fork in Karagorund, and I did win this campaign, quote-unquote winning. Realistically, this campaign had been over for a while. One of the things that I believe Tomb Kings should have is the ability of winning a campaign, even if allies hold these settlements. Of course, you do have to rebuild all of the pyramids of Khemri, so you do need to hold some very key settlements, but that's nowhere near the same problem as having to take settlements from factions you might not wish to fight. It is a ridiculous system when you're forced to fight certain factions that you either wouldn't care about or could become your allies or vassals even. So that is one of the problems. Like short campaign victory conditions like wiping out Manfred, wiping out Arkhan, Volkmar, okay, that's fair enough. But long campaign, just a bit ridiculous. And this does apply to every Tomb King campaign in the game. I think Arkhan has the more sensible victory conditions, just because Arkhan is kind of supposed to be a lone wolf in a certain way, somewhat, and with the exception of him having to fight Manfred. But, you know, it's Manfred, who cares about you having to wipe him out? So that's one factor. The other factor has to do with the Books of Nagash themselves. So what they've done is they've changed some book locations around, but the system in itself still has a number of issues. First off, only certain books are actually useful. Like the third book, the second book, for instance, they're not worth all that much. The best books, and in this order, are the fifth book, the first book, and then fourth or sixth book, to a degree, but nowhere near as big as the fifth and first. The fifth because it gives army capacity, the first because it gives hero capacity. But here's the thing about these Books of Nagash. One, they're still in very distant locations away from you. Like for instance, I forced Marcetra all the way into the Empire just to acquire a book. I didn't need to. Sure, the effect wasn't that important, but to just get that completion done, I spent a lot of turns just marching on the Empire. And then I also sent 3 full stacks over here to claim a Book of Nagash from Lustria, which is an area of the campaign that I really don't like engaging with in general, but especially when you have unpleasant climate in your campaign, because that can be an issue for a lot of races. I would say it hurts the Tomb Kings a bit more than other races, though keep in mind Cetra does have a -1 turn construction time for all buildings. So the books being distantly located is an issue. You unable to acquire the books for any kind of diplomacy is another issue, because like with the victory conditions, you may end up having to fight factions that would be your natural allies. So say, for instance, one of the dwarves takes Caracade Peaks, well, guess what? You're going to have to fight the dwarves. It's worse in some campaigns than others, sure, but let's say you're playing Khalida, there is a book in Last Plateau, you are going to have to waste time to go over there to claim that book for your campaign. This can apply to the pyramids as well, because like if factions have the pyramid locations, you're going to have to fight them for those locations in order to complete your campaigns. You don't need to get the books to complete your campaigns, but they do offer powerful effects. The third thing with the books is that the effects are still randomized. So whenever you start the campaign, you can either get some very useful books, close to your starting location, which means you can actually utilize them in a campaign when it matters, or they can be on the other side of the map, and you're never really going to take advantage of those bugs. So that system in itself is frustrating. And this brings me to a big point. Pacing. Campaign pacing is all over the place in Total War Warhammer 3. Why I think Creative Assembly should do in general with regards to campaign pacing. Look at their statistics, because we know they have them. Look at their statistics, see what the average campaign duration is for the player base, and then subtract like 20, 30 turns or something along those lines from it, and within that period of time, basically everything should be unlockable, be it completing your objectives or getting access to higher tier units. Because right now it just feels like some things take very long, but you're just spending time grinding out even though you've long since won your campaign. So that's my perspective with regards to pacing. Look at the statistics, see how people are actually playing these campaigns on average, then take 20 turns or so from them, because people will generally play their campaigns a bit longer than when they've quote-unquote won. So just so that these kind of mechanics are actually relevant in a campaign. Now, beyond this, we also have to talk about hero capacity. So army capacity has been improved because canopic jars have been improved. So you can get a lot more army capacity in a campaign, even though you won't be running with as many armies as some other factions, and some of these armies will start feeling redundant. Like over here I have 10 armies, but I could get rid of 4 of them and I'd be perfectly fine. Though obviously having more armies is good. But here's the problem, resources. So in order to increase hero capacity, you not only need canopic jars, you also need resources, which ties together with the idea that you may end up having to fight factions that would be natural allies in order to get those resources. So for instance, Obsidian in Nehekara is only in one location, that is Forek's natural expansion path. So if you want to increase your Tomb Prince capacity, you are forced to fight Forek. It applies with other resources as well, but I do think that if an ally holds a resource site, you should be able to increase your capacity if an ally, or rather a vassal, controls a resource. That's my perspective, because otherwise you're either fighting with your heroes or you're forced to attack allied factions or vassal factions in order to gain those resources. I do think Tomb King should work based on the idea of vassalization, because that is a factor of them in the lore, especially for Cetra. But the game does impose limitations on that whole thing working. So again, either limited heroes, or what you're doing is actually quite stupid. You're picking a fight with factions that should be your allies, you're taking the territory you need, and then you're getting peace agreements with these factions because you just got what you wanted. So for instance, I got the Wizard Caliph Palace, I've achieved my victory conditions right here, I'll just get a peace agreement and eventually a vassalization with Rapunzel right here, because again, I have taken what I needed in this situation, right? And eventually I can vassalize, and that is a pretty silly dynamic as far as I see it with regards to Tomb Kings. Now, on top of that, when we're looking at the Tomb King campaign, the fact that you don't start with an extra army unlocked does limit your early game options by quite a bit. Later on, you'll get as many armies as you need or want, but early on, having that limitation for something like 8 turns or 10 turns, really, though you can generally actually outpace research and just get an extra army capacity through the Mortuary Cult, is a pretty silly situation. Speaking about limits, one of the things I have found playing this campaign and other campaigns is that the item drop chance for Tomb Kings is very low. Like, I played a good number of battles in this campaign. Manual battles, auto-resolve battles, I think the vast majority of them are auto-resolve by default, right? But yeah, 85 auto-resolve, 50. Only 15! That's a bit of a small number. It certainly felt a lot more than that. But most of those were settlement battles, just keep in mind, not really against armies, and certainly not against armies that could defeat me. Still, Despite the fact that, I have 100 battles there, the item drop chance seems lower for Tomb Kings than other races. I understand that the idea is perhaps that you're supposed to use the Mortuary Cult, but here's the problem with that. A lot of the Canopic Jars, especially early on in the campaign, are going to be better used elsewhere. They're going to be used for research, they're going to use for capacities, like increase your army capacity for dynasties at certain key points of a campaign matters. A lot of the research does require Canopic Jars. So using Canopic Jars just to craft yourself some items is a kind of bit of a waste. Like, would you rather save up a bunch of Canopic Jars to get yourself more heroes, more armies, research, or would you... And also using Canopic Jars for these... for these decrees that give you a bit of research money, etc. What do you think is more useful? Especially because these decrees in particular are very expensive. So you can get a lot more Canopic Jars than you might have gotten at any point with the Tomb Kings, but you're also going to be spending them a lot. It mostly works with the exception of items. So that is another issue. I think like the item drop chance by default should be on par with other races. I think it's also an issue for the dwarves. I had believed that CA had fixed this for them, but maybe they screwed something up with 6.3. Certainly there are plenty of bugs. And finally, the last point that actually does hurt the Tomb Kings quite a bit. Limitations on units. So a lot of the units that Tomb Kings have, their actual army, doesn't feel all that great. So you look at things like Tomb Guard, they're decent, but they're not fantastic units. Same with Skeleton Archers. Yes, Khalida can make Skeletal Archers much better, but even then they're just an inferior archer unit compared to others. Cavalry is not that great. The only units that you have that are actually pretty phenomenal, like your artillery is good, but your artillery is also severely limited, and there's only two options for artillery units. There's the Screaming Skulls catapults, which you can increase capacity mainly through a tier 3 building that takes a while to build up. Also, it should be pointed out, a lot of these pyramids, or all of these pyramids, require you to spend surplus points in order to make them. But you either have Screaming Skull catapults, or you have Casket of Souls that you can use artillery. Pretty solid artillery options, pretty good, but very limited in numbers. Ushapti, pretty good unit, and you can get a good amount of them, but by the time you're getting so many Ushapti, your campaign is pretty much over and just feels like fluff, and that is a really big point. Still, pretty good unit. Tomb Scorpions feel pretty underwhelming. You can get a lot of different units through Necrotect, if I do have one, because now you can, I believe you can now get all of these skills, and I don't think that was the case before, but you can get Tomb Scorpions, Necropolis Knights, and Ushapti. I don't think that was the case before. You had to choose, if I'm not mistaken. Could be wrong on that. But yeah, Ushapti are the only really fun unit that you can get on Mass Chariots are okay, and you will get the building for artillery. But it's generally better to prioritize Ushapti and to prioritize Tomb Guard, as underwhelming as they feel as, like their actual baseline stats. Like, let me put it like this in a way. They're a tier 2 unit that is inferior to a lot of other tier 2 units, with the exception of weapon strength. But when you're looking at tier 3 units, like, yeah, Empire Greatswords are a better melee unit. And Empire Greatswords are not a great melee unit within the context of Warhammer 3. And even Ushapti, they're kind of like trolls, really. Great bows are awesome. They're basically not an archer unit, but more like a very, very precise artillery unit with all the pros and cons that come with that. Mostly pros, but there's some line of sight issues that can have with that. The issue is with regards to all these awesome constructs. So you get Necrosphinxes, War Sphinxes, Bone Giants, and Hyro Titans. But again, by the time you can even get one of these or two of these, you've already long since won your campaign. Like, outside of the one Sphinx that Cetra started with, these are the only ones that I've gotten in this entire campaign, and this was post turn 50. So some pacing issues with regards to that. And Cetra has a growth benefit. To be sure, I did spend a lot of that to actually complete victory conditions, as opposed to rushing for tier 4 and tier 5 as quickly as possible. But let's say, with regards to that. It's kind of like the same situation with Thunder Barges or with Kadai. It is better that they moved them in Tier 4, but we're still in a situation where with Tomb Kings, like with virtually every other campaign, it's always the early game that's hardest. And I don't think the Tomb King early game is that harder than other races. It's just frustrating to deal with because of the limitations, having limited armies, limited heroes, etc., limited units. Having a situation where inherently your buildings are slower to build unless you're Cetra, but even then you're still slower to build. Having a situation where your armies are free, but your buildings are harder to construct and it's hard to unlock units. Like the combination of slower buildings, unit capacity, limited armies is not really a great dynamic in general. Unit capacities, from my perspective, are not really a great mechanic. There are ways of improving unit capacity that they've added from Research Tree, to be sure. Some of these feel completely pointless, but as you may notice, I haven't really bothered with any of these, because by the time I could get these, one, because it's better to focus on other things, heroes, and secondly, because by the time I could have that choice realistically, I would, besides, sacrifice that for heroes, and I always think heroes are worth it more, it just felt better to spend my research on other stuff because I could, generally speaking, get the units through buildings at that point. So what they tried to do in terms of improving diversity of the Tomb King army just didn't work out. Certainly they could benefit from a DLC that would add more units, but also they need a revamp in terms of campaign pacing, all of these kind of systems, including vassalization. Like if vassalization were improved. Now, some will argue that, well, you're playing a race that's slow plays, just play the game slower, to which my reply would always be, the game is very early game centric. Now, it shouldn't be like that, and instead we should have a better end game, but the inverted difficulty curve has been the case in every Total War game I've played. Like, you can look back at Rome 1, and I've been playing Total War since Rome 1. You could finish a campaign in Rome 1 in 30-40 turns, really. Or get to a point where you're never going to lose. That is the case. Very few games. I think like Three Kingdoms is the only one. And that's one of the things I think Creative Assembly should focus on, sure, to improve the late game. But the problem with Tomb Kings in the late game is a limitation on climate. Because you look at Cetra's campaign as an example. You have desert. Okay, but desert is a very small and limited portion of the map. So you've got desert, you have savanna, very, very limited. The only thing that you have going for you is wasteland. So you do have the entirety of the Darklands, which is pretty far away. But the problem with having a kind of campaign where, like, oh, take it slow, build up all that, if the climate situation doesn't favor it, then it just doesn't work. This is one of the things I really like about Cast Wars, because Cast War and Oxyatol is that they do have every climate available to them in the game, and I can tell you that it does vastly improve their campaign situation. Like, if Cetra had temperate, or if all Tomb Kings had temperate, that would be much better. Khalida does have mountains, but dealing with the mountains when you don't have a way of using the Underway is not an especially great dynamic in a campaign. But those are my thoughts, my perspective with regards to Tomb Kings after their rework. To be clear, it is better, and if there is one thing I do like is the fact that they did add downsides for a number of these dynasties. So, for instance, you can get some really powerful things for dynasties, but you can also get a lot of vampiric corruption, which does end up becoming an issue. So, that's a decent enough. Like, I'm not in favor of them overhauling the control system, the corruption system, because I think that it's very easy to screw up. I think that their efforts should be better spent elsewhere in every single way, AI, sieges, campaign dynamics. But it is a better system because you have ways of countering it. That's not a problem. You have buildings, you have commandments, you have other dynasties that can help you out. Like the third dynasty can help you out quite a bit over there if you do unlock it. But it is just something extra, right, to worry about there with regards to vampiric corruption in that situation. So that's all I had to say on the subject. I mean, Tomb Kings do have an issue because of the way diplomacy works. Like some people say, oh, I would just now use the vassal system. All right, so you don't use the vassal system. What does that really change? It just means you fight a lot more people that you don't need to fight. and what change does that make? Because if you think vassals are going to be useful, well, let's just say Forik has been sitting on his ass for a very, very long time in his campaign, doing absolutely nothing. There's problems with AI, by the way. Like, the Lizardman AI Flawed doesn't work anymore in 6.3. And and just in general, a lot of issues with AI not doing stuff. I've seen the AI capable of doing stuff, but clearly there are scripting issues with AI right here in the game at the moment, just in general. Quasine signing out. Stay tuned for more.